Welcome to our series on St. Matthew's Gospel. We are dealing with Matthew chapter 27, and we're looking at the amazing events that happened immediately after the death of Jesus, in which God the Father vindicated his Son and gave messages to Israel that would be very intelligible, not only to the Sanhedrin, but also to the people as well. In our last episode, I finished by telling you the incredible miracle that the group of Roman soldiers who had witnessed everything, that they came to the conclusion that everybody else should have come to. And that is, just by the witness of my eyes and my ears, I know that this person is the Son of God. I don't need any other evidence. Now, Matthew is saying, the men who are saying this, and he said with one voice, which is amazing, the men who are saying this have no scriptures, no prophets. They have no covenant. They are described very well by St. Paul in Ephesians chapter 2. They represent the whole Gentile world, and Paul says, don't forget that there was a time when you, who are pagans physically, termed the uncircumcision by those who called themselves the circumcision. He said, don't forget that you had no Christ, that you were excluded from membership of Israel. You were aliens with no part in the covenant or the promise. You were immersed in the world without hope and without God. That's the description of these men and all that they represent. And yet, just by witnessing the death of Jesus, these men were filled with the salutary fear that brought them to this acknowledgement of the Christ. Now that means there's no excuse for any of the Jewish people present, because they have the circumcision, they have the covenant, they have the prophets, they have the scriptures, they have everything. And there's certainly no excuse for the Sanhedrin. But there's nothing more blinding than hatred. And there's nothing more blinding than pride. And they bring us down in the most awful way. So, in front of their eyes, the Sanhedrin have heard Wisdom chapter 2 being fulfilled. They've heard Isaiah 53 being fulfilled. And they have heard Psalm 22 being fulfilled. Read them. If they looked them up, they might have had some salutary fear as well. So, all these signs given to us in these verses are God's way of vindicating Jesus. That he is the Son of God, it's plainly obvious to everybody. Even the pagans recognize it. But the strange thing is, only the pagans actually acknowledge it. Now, here you have the two ends of the gospel pulled together. When Jesus came in the incarnation, when he was born in Bethlehem, it was the pagans from foreign lands who actually acknowledged him, where the king of the Jews, Herod, and the Sanhedrin refused. Here at the end of his life, it's the pagans from a foreign land, this time from Italy, from Rome. They acknowledge him, and the Jewish people, and led by the Sanhedrin, they refuse. Nothing has changed. It's really sad. But still, all the evidence has been given that he is the Son of God. Jerusalem's punishment has already begun in the darkness, the earthquake, and all the other signs immediately after Jesus' death. It will continue until it is destroyed altogether. They demanded that Jesus come down from the cross because if he was the Son of God, which he claimed to be, then the Father would rescue him. The answer is the Father has rescued him, but not out of death, has rescued him through death. And the victory that Jesus has will be proclaimed to the Sanhedrin in all truth by Roman soldiers, not by anybody else. So, everything has vindicated Jesus, and therefore, if they could only see what they're looking at, they would remember Jeremiah 31:3, that God said to them centuries earlier, I have loved you with an everlasting love. and I'm constant in my affection for you. I don't love you because your behavior. I don't love you because your reactions to me. I just love you anyway. And this is the extraordinary thing about God, is that he loves us because he is love. And love is his very essence of his being. And he challenges us to try and become like him a little bit by learning how to love and discovering the extraordinary power that is in love, and that love can literally transform other people's lives. Now, it's at this point that Matthew brings in a subject that has been brought in much earlier in the other Gospels dealing with the Passion of Jesus. I'll read it for you. This is verses 55 and 56. And many women were there, watching from a distance because they weren't allowed to come close. But the only people who were allowed to come close were the Sanhedrin, because they were the accusers. And so they were allowed to come right up to the cross if they wanted to. So the women had to watch at a distance. The same women who had followed Jesus from Galilee and had looked after him. So the women are identified. Among them were Mary of Magdala, number 1, Mary the mother of James, Joseph, and you add Simon and Jude, the brothers of Jesus, that's number 2, and the mother of Zebedee's sons, that's Salome. Okay, let's have a look at these women just for a minute. The women have been involved with Jesus from the beginning of his ministry. And as time went on, the women actually joined Jesus in many of his journeys. And as Matthew says there, they actually looked after the apostles. That means they looked after their clothes and their food and all the ordinary things that would make life much easier for them on their way. And since some of these women were very wealthy, like Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward, and Mary of Magdala and Martha, they were all very wealthy women. There was no problem about having the financial needs of the group actually met. So there are 2 huge groups of witnesses here that are very important for Jesus' death. One are the Roman soldiers, who've seen everything, who've been involved in everything, who've already come to a conclusion. And these women, who've also been there for everything, and they've witnessed everything. And both of these groups can testify Jesus Christ died. Because one of the heresies that will turn up in a very short years is that people will say if he was God, he couldn't die. It's going to be one of the Gnostic heresies. So these women were the faithful disciples. And so here you have the 2 sons again. The men were unfaithful and the women were faithful. Now, it's only when you go to Luke and John you realize why the women were faithful. I don't think they were better than the men. It's just that the women clung to Jesus' mother, and she was the model for them. Anybody who clung to her stayed faithful to Jesus. There was one of the apostles clung to her, that was John, and he also stayed faithful to Jesus as well. And that's very important for our day as well, that particular message. So these women have heard Jesus' teaching. They committed themselves to him. And they were taught by Jesus' mother to be semper fidelis. That is always faithful, always faithful. It doesn't matter what your eyes see, your ears hear, or anything else. Always be faithful to the Lord. And in the list of the women, now we have a list of the men, and Peter was always first. James and John always second. And Judas Iscariot always last. And when you get the list of the women, Mary of Magdala is always first. And Mary, the wife of Clopas, who may be Mary of Alphaeus, there's a bit of difficulty distinguishing that, she's always second. And John tells you that she actually stood at the cross with John and with Mary of Magdala. So Mary is always first. She was the most heroic of the converts of Jesus. And she also was a born leader. And Jesus allowed her to lead. And the women allowed her to lead as well. And so Mary of Clopas, or Alphaeus, whichever it is is the mother of James and Joseph and Simon and Jude, very, very close to Jesus and Mary, long before the public ministry, because they lived very close to them in Nazareth, and their children grew up together. Jesus grew up with these young boys as if they were family, okay? And then the other family that was very close to them in Nazareth was the family of Zebedee, and the wife's name was Salome, and the two sons were James and John. So these women were outstanding witnesses to Jesus, not only in their own lives, but in the lives of their children, because their children committed themselves completely to Jesus and to his cause. And the women remained faithful to the very end. We're not told mercifully what they said to their sons on Holy Saturday. Like, where were you? We were all here. So mercifully, I suppose, Matthew doesn't go into that kind of detail. So these women are witnesses to Jesus' life, to his ministry, to his passion, to his death, and they're going to be the first to witness his resurrection as well. So primary witnesses. So the two most unlikely groups are the primary witnesses: soldiers, complete outsiders, and women who were at the lowest level of society in those days. So let's come to the burial of Jesus. But before we do, let's just remind ourselves of something that we met in chapter 11 and verse 25, that Jesus said, "Father, I thank you that you have revealed yourself to the little ones, to the lowly, the poor and the lowly, and not to the learned and the clever." So here you have the women and the soldiers. They're all the poor and the lowly, and the revelation of who Jesus is given to them. But the Sanhedrin, they don't get anything because they've set their minds against him. So the burial of Jesus deserves a good bit of attention, because the normal thing to do for a man who had been crucified is to dig a hole in the ground just where he died, dump him in, no shroud, no funeral service, no anointing, no nothing. He was a disgrace, cursed be any man who hangs on a tree, dump. And the family wouldn't even admit that they had such a son or brother or father. That's not what happened to Jesus. And so we have to look at why Jesus was buried like a king. When it came to evening, there was a rich man from Arimathea called Joseph. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, who had himself been a disciple of Jesus. Now, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were two very close friends. Matthew never mentions Nicodemus. For Nicodemus, you've got to go elsewhere. So we'll stick with what Matthew says. Joseph of Arimathea, a very wealthy man. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate thereupon ordered that it would be handed over. I'm sure Pilate was wondering what the fuss was. You all demanded that we kill him in this absolutely horrendous way, and now you want to give him a decent burial? So Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean shroud, and put it in his own new tomb, which had been hewn out of rock, fit for a prince, because Joseph of Arimathea was a prince. He then rolled a large stone across the entrance of the tomb, and he went away. So let's look at this for a minute. First of all, something that Matthew doesn't emphasize, but that if you are reading it slowly enough and prayerfully enough, it'll hit you. The moment Jesus dies, total silence falls over Golgotha. Everybody goes away silently, the way we do on Good Friday. We walk away from the ceremonies in silence. There's nothing to be said. There's only hearts that need to repent. And so all the people went away, including the Sanhedrin, all went away in silence. There was enough to think about. The only people who remain are Jesus' friends, and they have the unenviable task of removing the nails and the crown of thorns and taking him down and preparing him for burial. Now, it's at this particular moment that a member of the Sanhedrin shows up the Sanhedrin completely by coming out of the shadows and saying, "This man must be given the burial of a king. He's the King of the Jews." Even if you don't believe he's the Son of God, even if you don't believe he's the Messiah, he's the Davidic king. He gets the burial of a king, and he absolutely insists on the burial of a king. So when he goes to Pilate, Pilate would be completely shocked that after all he's experienced, that they want to give him the burial of a king. Joseph of Arimathea only has to say he was the rightful heir to the throne of David. He must be given the burial of a king. And so Pilate gives permission. Pilate doesn't seem to be able to get rid of this Jesus of Nazareth. He keeps on coming back, and more demands are made of him. The Sanhedrin can't get rid of him either, because each time that they try to get rid of Jesus of Nazareth, there's another problem about Jesus of Nazareth coming up and coming up and coming up. The Sanhedrin were never off the hook, because the evidence kept on coming back to them. And when they thought they had dealt with everything, then all of a sudden you get these totally transformed apostles turning up and preaching in Jerusalem. And instead of one, they have 12. And instead of 12, they have 3,000. And then they have 5,000, and they decide, listen, we've got to squash this thing for good. And Gamaliel said, you might find yourselves fighting against God. Stop. So I won't go on. Jesus' friends remain at the cross, and they have to do this awful work. They all know Isaiah 53 verse 9. They gave him a grave with the wicked, so he had to die with the wicked on either side of him, but he was buried with the rich. That's Joseph of Arimathea. And so Joseph of Arimathea risked nothing going to Pilate, because Pilate wouldn't see any issues, but he was giving himself huge trouble with the Sanhedrin. We're not told the details. I would find it very difficult to believe that the Sanhedrin kept him as a member after this. So it was a very unusual thing to do. But what the scriptures tell us is that after the death of Jesus, people came out of the most amazing situations and became believers and followers of Jesus. Now, again, I'm always trying to show you how Matthew ties up ends. At the beginning of the Passion of Jesus, a woman believer anointed Jesus for burial, and here at the end, a man believer actually wraps him in his shroud and buries him. So you see, all the believers are put together as equal. And it's just done so quietly that you hardly notice that what they're actually doing. The other thing you won't notice unless somebody tells you, or unless you study Greek, is that Matthew never refers to Jesus as a corpse. Corpse is patoma. He doesn't say that. He refers to the body of Jesus as soma, a living body. It's a very interesting thing. And it's only when you go back to the original text that you'll get details like that. That they don't ever remember Jesus as dead. They only remember him as the living one. Jesus, the living one. Okay. The next detail that Matthew gives you is that a large stone was put in front of the tomb. Well, a large stone is only put in front of a large tomb. And so the tomb that Joseph of Arimathea had built for himself was fit for a king. And so Jesus is given the burial of a king. You're also told that nobody had ever been placed in it before, so it had never been contaminated with any rottenness. That's very important. Very important. Psalm 16 says, Lord, you wouldn't allow your Holy One to rot in the tomb, but you also wouldn't allow him to touch any rottenness. Okay, when you go back to Jesus entering Jerusalem as the Messiah, you were told specifically that the colt had never been ridden before, that this was something that Jesus was doing, this was his action, and so this was completely new. So the purity of the tomb is terribly important for the purity of the one who goes into it. That's actually very important. And then you're told something very simple in verse 61. Now Mary of Magdala and the other Mary, that's the wife of Clopas or Alphaeus, whichever the husband's name is, both of them are sitting there watching. And so these are two of the primary witnesses to everything, these two women, because they're there and they don't want to leave Jesus. They don't want to leave the tomb. If that's where he is, they don't want to leave that place. Okay. And so the two women sitting there represent one of the responses that the church has tried to give ever since. And that is that over the period of the Paschal days, the Thursday and the Friday and the Saturday, we have a vigil each day. That we actually keep vigil after the agony in the garden. We keep vigil after the death of Jesus, and we keep vigil before the resurrection. And that vigil, watching and praying for the Master's return, is an essential part of the gospel. I just wish people would be told it today, that they would be reminded as to the value of what they're doing, so that they could enter in and make it something very valuable for their own lives and for the life of the church today. So the next thing that Matthew begins to emphasize is the guard at the tomb. Now, we've already met Roman soldiers at the cross of Jesus, but Matthew has two different names for the group of soldiers at the cross of Jesus and the group of soldiers at the tomb. And he indicates that the group of soldiers at the tomb are not friends, they're enemies. So he simply calls them custodia. He called the other ones terreontes. They're two very different names to give to two groups of soldiers. Anybody looking at the men wouldn't be able to see any difference, but Matthew is not looking at them from the outside. Matthew is looking at them from what is going on the inside. So let's just read it at least on this particular occasion. Next day, that is when preparation day was over. Now, preparation day is the preparation for the Sabbath. And here's something we need to look at. The day after Jesus died was a Sabbath. And if the Sabbath fell at the time of the Passover, it was considered the most sacred, holy day they could possibly have. And it was on that sacred Sabbath that the Son of Man rested in his tomb after the labor of redemption. I'll share a little bit more of that with you when I speak to you next time. Thanks for listening. Slán agus benach dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.